The iron rod came up dry for the third time before noon. Sarah Henley watched from the kitchen window as the youngest of Asa Crandall's men hauled the baler up the wooden derrick a half-mile out on her south quarter. Even at that distance, she could see the truth of it. The bucket at the rope's end held nothing but pale dust. Behind her, Caleb stirred the cornmeal she had set on the stove. He was 10 years old and small for his age, but he had learned to cook a plain supper while his mother kept her hands busy elsewhere. He did not ask what the men were finding. He had been listening to the iron rod fall and rise for 3 days. "Mama," he said, "I know." She wiped her hands on her apron. The blue calico was her second-best dress. She had put it on that morning because she had known, the way a woman knows weather, that the men would come to the door before sundown. She did not wait for the knock. She opened the door as Crandall reached the second step of her porch. He stopped with one boot raised. He removed his hat in the slow, formal way of a man who had practiced the gesture many times that summer. "Mrs. Henley, Mr. Crandall." He folded his hat into both hands. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed close. His coat had been good wool once, dust gray now from the prairie. "The rod went 60 feet, he said. "I'm sorry to say it. The deep aquifer has retreated under this whole township. There's no water here for 50 miles in any direction." "I see. I've been drilling on the high plains 9 years. 600 wells between here and the Oklahoma line. The rod tells you what's down there. Nothing personal, ma'am. I'd not take it personal." He produced a folded paper from his coat. "I wrote up an offer last night. $32 for the full quarter section. 20 cents an acre. It's the kindest thing I can do for you and the boy." She did not reach for the paper. He set it on the porch rail himself. "I'll think on it, Mr. Crandall. Don't think too long. Winter's 6 weeks out and the Eastern train runs Tuesdays. Good evening, Mr. Crandall." She closed the door before her face could change. She heard his boots descend the porch. She heard him remount. She did not move from the door until the sound of the horse was small. When she turned around, Caleb was holding the wooden spoon as if he had forgotten what to do with it. "Eat your supper," she said. "Then bring me the ledger from the desk." She counted the money on the kitchen table while he ate. $14.30 in coin and small bills. The drilling fee in May had been $80, the last of Thomas's savings, paid before he caught the typhoid. The ledger showed her clearly. She had paid for the well that came up dry. She had paid for the verdict that was now sitting folded on her porch rail. On the wall above the desk hung the homestead claim register. 3 years filed, 2 years to prove up. The federal certificate, when it came, required a visible water source. Under Kansas homestead law as it stood that summer, no well meant no patent. No patent meant no land. A widow could continue her husband's claim. The Federal Homestead Act had made room for that decades back, but the law required the same proof from her hand it would have required from his. She heard Caleb set his bowl in the sink. "Mama," he said, "are we leaving?" "No." "Then where will we get the water?" She pressed her palm flat against the ledger. She thought of the $80. She thought of the iron rod. She thought of her grandfather walking the prairie in a long-ago summer with a small leather notebook in his shirt pocket, stopping at every cottonwood as if at a friend's door. "I don't know yet, child. But we are not leaving." A wagon rattled outside. She lifted the curtain. Mrs. Leila Bauer was climbing down at the front gate, half a loaf of bread under one arm and an apologetic look already arranged on her face. Sarah went to the door. Some kindnesses, she had learned that summer, were harder to receive than refusals. Mrs. Bauer stayed 20 minutes. She left the bread, half a jar of plum preserves, and an apology that took most of those minutes to deliver. "Hank and I would help with grain through winter," she said at the gate. "We would. But Hank still owes Mr. Crandall for last March's pump work." You understand, Sarah? I understand. It's only the men in the valley take Mr. Crandall's word for these things. They have to. He's the only rig within 80 miles. I know it. Mrs. Bauer climbed back into the wagon. I'll bring more bread Friday. If there's still a place to bring it to. She drove off. Sarah stood at the gate until the dust had settled. Inside, Caleb was already in his bed in the loft. Sarah did not light the second lamp. She sat at the kitchen table with a small flame between her hands and tried to read the ledger one more time. The figures had not changed. She slept perhaps 2 hours. At 2:15 by the pendulum clock, she gave up. She lit the lamp again and went to Thomas's old desk in the corner and pulled the bottom drawer all the way out. There were 3 years of farm receipts in it. There was a small tin of pencils. There was, beneath everything else, a thin leather notebook she had not opened since the winter her grandfather died. She had been 25 then. The notebook had been on his bedside table the morning the pneumonia took him. She had put it in her trunk and closed the lid because the sight of his small, careful handwriting had been too much to bear that week. She had not looked at it again. 7 winters had moved over it. She took it to the kitchen table. The cover was soft, worn at the corners. Inside, on the first page, his name in pencil, Ezra Whitfield. Surveyor's notes. Smoky Hill to Solomon River. She turned the pages slowly. He had not drawn maps. He had drawn trees. Page after page of pencil sketches, the willows along Mulberry Creek, soap weed on the hard sand, a sand cherry thicket with notes on its root depth. Cottonwoods, too, especially cottonwoods. Each sketch with a small arrow pointing down and a number written beside it. On a page near the middle, she stopped. He had drawn 5 cottonwood trunks in a circle. The trunks were heavy and deeply cross-hatched. The leaves were sketched as small feathered shapes. Beneath the drawing, in the careful pencil line she remembered, he had written, "Cottonwoods take their water from above clay. 5 together within a wagon width. Water within 12 feet of your boots. The tree drinks what the rod cannot reach." She set the notebook on the table and pressed both palms down on it to steady the trembling in her hands. She remembered, suddenly and clearly, the summer she was 9 years old. She had walked beside him along the bend of a dry creek in eastern Kansas, near the Riley County line. He had stopped at a single cottonwood on the gravel bank. The bark had been gray-brown, deeply furrowed even then. "How old, child?" "I don't know, Grandpa." 22 summers. The bark tells you. Now, how many cottonwoods stand within the throw of your bonnet? She had counted, looking up. 5, Grandpa. He had set his hand on the trunk of the nearest tree as if greeting it. And the water is closer than the men with their iron rods could ever guess. The trees know before the well does. Remember that, Sarah Margaret. Men forget. You won't, if I do my work right. She had not understood then. She had been 9. She'd been counting on her fingers. She closed the notebook gently. Outside, the pre-dawn wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere far off, a coyote spoke once. She had 11 months of widow waiting still on the calendar. She had $14 and a son who needed breakfast in 3 hours. But she had a notebook her grandfather had filled for her with a patience she was only now beginning to recognize. And she had 5 cottonwoods somewhere on her 160 acres, if his words were true. If they were not true, she would have spent 7 days digging in dry sand. The boy would face winter on cornmeal and prayer. There would be no second chance. She sat with that fact a long time. Then she opened the notebook again and turned to the page with the 5 trunks, and she did not close it again until the sun came up. She did not tell Caleb about the notebook at breakfast. She told him after, when the dishes were dry and the cattle had been led to the seep 3 miles south. She set the small leather book on the table between them and put her finger on the page with the 5 trunks. "Your great-grandpa wrote this for me when I was a girl. I had forgotten most of it. Caleb leaned over the page. He could not yet read all the script. He traced the Cottonwood sketches with his finger, the way he traced the creatures in his Sunday primer. "What does it mean, Mama?" "It means we are going to do something the men in the valley have forgotten how to do. We're going to walk slow and listen." He nodded, the way 10-year-old boys nod when they are choosing to trust a thing they do not yet understand. She tied her bonnet. She walked the south quarter on the first day. She counted stragglers along the dry creek bed, single cottonwoods, 2 together once, never the cluster of 5. She was learning to count not just the trunks but the bark. Her grandfather's notebook was clear. Deep furrows meant old roots, and old roots meant a long history of drinking from the same shallow place. The young trees with smooth gray bark could not be trusted yet. They had not yet found their water. By dusk, she had counted 47 cottonwoods on the south quarter. Not one cluster of 5 within a wagon width. She walked the west quarter on the second day. Caleb came with her, the notebook in his shirt pocket. They found a stand of 3 together near the dip where her husband had once thought of putting a sod barn. The trunks were narrow. The bark was only just beginning to furrow. 3 is hope, she said quietly to herself, but it is not enough. Caleb wrote 3, too young in the back of the notebook in his careful schoolboy hand. He had asked her permission first. The afternoon of the second day was when Crandall Road passed. He reined his horse up at the south fence and looked at the small woman walking slowly along the line of dead grass with her boy trailing behind. He laughed once, sharp. "Mrs. Henley, you'll wear out shoes you can't afford to replace." "Did you lose something out here?" "No. Mr. Crandall, if you're hunting jackrabbits, I'd suggest a snare." He waited for her to answer. She did not. "Only that paper signed by Saturday. I've drilled 600 wells." The rod said dry. He waited again. He waited longer than he had meant to wait. Then he touched his hat brim and rode east toward Marlin Springs. Caleb watched the horse get small. "Mama, why didn't you tell him?" "Because he wouldn't have heard me. The trees aren't ready to speak to him yet, and neither am I." She walked the upland on the third day. The upland was the part of her quarter section that the men in the valley said was the worst. It was a slight rise on the northeast corner, treeless for many distance, the grass already gone gold in the August sun. The drillers had set their derrick on the lower ground, where men expected water to be. The notebook said otherwise. The notebook said, "Look for the dark green inside the gold." She walked the upland slowly. She walked at once with her eyes on the ground for the cracked earth, and once with her eyes on the horizon for color. She found them on the second pass. A small rise no higher than a man's shoulder, and on the rise 5 mature cottonwoods standing close enough that their crowns made one shared shadow. The trunks were 18, 19, 24 inches across. The bark was gray-brown and so deeply furrowed that her finger could lay full inside the grooves. Inside the circle of the canopy, the prairie grass was still silver green. Outside it, the grass had gone the color of dry straw. She stood at the edge of the green and she did not move for a long time. The wind came through the heart-shaped leaves above her and made the silver sound she had not heard since she was a girl walking with her grandfather. The tree drinks what the rod cannot reach. She heard his voice as plainly as if he were standing at her elbow. She walked into the center of the circle. She set her boot heel where the ground felt firmest. She drove her stake of cottonwood deadfall into the earth with 3 steady blows of the hammer she had carried in her apron pocket for 2 days. The opening would be just enough for one woman to stand and dig. Caleb came up the rise behind her, breathing hard from the climb. "Mama, the leaves are silver." "Yes. Are we going to dig here?" "Tomorrow at first light." She put her hand on the deepest furrowed of the 5 trunks. The wind moved the leaves once more. The shared shadow held them both. She woke before dawn on the 4th day. She lit the kitchen lamp and packed the day's tools while the coffee water boiled. Thomas's pickaxe, 2 shovels, the long-handled one for sod, the short-handled one for the close work of the shaft, 60 feet of hemp rope from the barn, the oak bucket from the kitchen well that had failed her in spring, 3 poles of cottonwood deadfall for the windlass. She carried them up the rise in 2 trips while the sky behind the prairie turned the color of weak tea. Caleb followed on the second trip, half asleep, dragging his boots. "Mama, eat your bread on the walk. We start when the light comes." The first cut was the hardest. The sod on the upland was 3 years tight and a hand's length deep. She brought the pickaxe down with both arms and her whole shoulder behind the swing. The blade bounced. She struck again. By the time the sun cleared the eastern grass, she had broken through the sod and was into the dry, sandy loam beneath. By noon, she was 2 feet down. She drank water from the canvas bag. She ate a piece of cold bread. She climbed back into the hole. Caleb worked the windlass alone all afternoon. He had set it the night before, 3 poles lashed at the apex with hemp, the bucket riding the rope between 2 pulleys made from his great-grandfather's harness brass. He hauled up bucket after bucket of dry, pale loam and tipped them onto the growing mound at the edge of the cottonwoods. He did not complain. He did not ask when they would stop. On the second day of the digging, he learned how to feed her water without being asked. She would knock the bucket twice with the side of her shovel, and he would lower the canvas bag, and it would come up empty. She knocked the bucket 3 times when she needed to come up, and he would spring the catch and let the rope run free. By the end of the 5th day, she was 4 feet down. The walls of the shaft were powder dry. Crandall rode past at sunset and saw the small woman in dust-streaked blue calico standing chest-deep in a hole, her boy on the rope above her. He reined up. He looked at the hole. He laughed. "Hand-digging, with the boy on the rope? Mrs. Henley, you'll be down 20 feet before snow flies and still no water. The old folk tales won't fill a bucket." She did not look up. She drove her shovel into the wall of the shaft for the count of 3, the way her grandfather had once shown her how to ignore a man on a horse. Crandall's horse moved sideways, restless. Crandall did not know what to say. He had expected her to argue. He rode on. That night, Caleb fixed her hands by lamplight at the kitchen table. 8 blisters. He warmed bacon grease in a small tin and worked it into her palms with the carefulness of a much older boy. He cut strips from one of his old shirts and bound her hands. He did not speak. She did not speak either. The silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of 2 people lifting the same weight. When the bandages were tied, he took the notebook from his shirt pocket and read aloud, slowly, from the page he had been working at all week. "Cottonwoods take their water from a bove clay. 5 to get a width in a wag on width ter width in 12 feet of your boots." He looked up at her. "Did I read it right?" "You read it perfect, child. Then we keep going. We keep going." By the end of the 6th day, she was 6 feet down. The first thing she felt as she set her shovel for the next cut was a coolness against her wrist. She held still. She pressed her palm flat to the wall of the shaft. The clay was not yet showing, only loam, fine and pale. But the loam was damp, not wet, damp. She did not call up. She let the boy discover it himself when he lowered the bucket. He saw the dirt come up dark on the rim of the oak. He looked at the bucket. He looked down at her. "Mama, yes, it's wet, almost wet." He sat at the rim of the shaft with his legs hanging over and his face very serious. For the first time in 6 days, he smiled. "My great-grandpa," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." She climbed up the makeshift ladder of stakes she had driven into the wall, and she sat beside him at the lip of the well. And the wind moved the cottonwood leaves above them in the silver sound that meant the tree drank from somewhere just below. The seventh day was for stone. The field stones lay where the dry creek bed bent west, 3/4 of a mile from the homestead, scattered in gray-brown and roughly the size of a man's fist. Caleb rode the mule to the creek and back from sunrise to sundown. 6 trips, each trip with a flour sack of stones tied behind the saddle. Sarah rested her arms that day. She mortared nothing. She fitted the first 3 feet of the lining stone on stone, dry, by feel, the way men had been fitting wells for as long as there had been wells in this country. By the end of the 7th day, the lining was set. The shaft now had a gray stone cylinder rising from its bottom 3 feet up. It looked, when she stood at the rim and looked down, like the inside of a duvacoti turned upside down. The 8th day, she went deeper. At 8 feet, the loam darkened. At 9 feet, she struck the first thin streak of pale clay running diagonally through the wall, a hand's breadth wide, the color of skim milk. She ran her finger along it. Her grandfather's notebook had not used the word aquitard. He had written only, "The white layer holds the water above. Dig clean of it. Do not break it." She did not break it. She cut around it with the small shovel, careful as a midwife. That afternoon, Mrs. Bauer came up the rise with a fresh loaf of bread and stopped 20 paces short of the Cottonwoods. She had not seen the well take its shape until that moment. She stood with the loaf in both hands as if she had forgotten what to do with it. "Sarah, what are you doing up here?" Sarah climbed up the stake ladder, shook the dirt out of her bonnet, and drank water from the canvas bag. "I'm listening to my grandfather, Leela." Mrs. Bauer looked at the Cottonwoods. She looked at Caleb at the windlass. She looked at the gray stone cylinder rising out of the earth. She did not understand. She set the loaf on a flat stone at the edge of the green grass. "You've been digging 7 days. 8 tomorrow. I'll bring more bread Friday. I'd be obliged." She left. Sarah did not watch her go. She climbed back into the shaft. The 9th day was the day the seepage came. Slow, at first, a damp shine at the joints of the stone where she had set the lining the day before. By mid-morning, the shine had become a slow weeping. By mid-afternoon, there was an inch of standing water at the bottom of the shaft. She stood in it. Her boots took it up to the laces. She did not call up to Caleb yet. She wanted to be sure. She kept digging through the inch. The 10th day was the day the water rose. She had been working perhaps an hour past sunrise. She brought her spade down for what she meant to be the next cut, and the spade went through into a layer of fine, clean sand, the color of new flour. The water came up out of the sand the way milk comes up over the rim of an overfull pail, smooth, steady. Not a trickle, a flow. She stepped back against the stone wall of the shaft. She watched the water rise around her boots. She watched it rise to her ankles and the time it took her to draw 4 breaths. "Caleb." "Yes, Mama." "Send the rope down." "The well is here." He sent the rope. She tied it under her arms. He hauled her up the way he had hauled the buckets for 10 days. By the time her boots cleared the rim of the well, the water at the bottom had risen 6 inches above the layer of sand. By the time she sat down on the upturned pickaxe at the edge of the Cottonwoods, she could see the water shining clear from the surface down to the stones. They measured the first hour by the kitchen pendulum clock. Caleb ran down the rise and back up with the clock in his arms. He set the clock on a flat stone. He marked the minute hand. He took the bucket down on the rope, drew it up full, poured it into Thomas's old wash tub, and lowered the bucket again. 8 bucketfuls, 1 gallon each. 8 gallons in 60 minutes. The water at the bottom of the shaft was no lower than it had been when he had begun. The cottonwoods above them moved their silver leaves once. Caleb stood beside the wash tub with the empty bucket in his hand. He looked at his mother. He did not smile. The thing was too large for smiles yet. "Mama," the cottonwoods told the truth. "Yes, child." She sat on the upturned pickaxe, and she put her face in her hands, and she wept, quietly, without sound, for a long time. Caleb did not move. He only stood at the rim of the well, watching the water rise back up to where it had been when she climbed out. The news traveled from Mrs. Bauer to her husband Hank by Friday evening, from Hank to the blacksmith by Saturday noon, and from the blacksmith to the general store before church on Sunday. By midweek, every man in Marlin Springs had heard that the widow Henley had struck water at 12 feet on the upland the drillers had sworn was dry. Crandall was at the counter of the general store the morning the news reached him. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hand on the counter the way some men would have. He laughed once, sharp, and then he turned to the men gathered at the stove and said the thing that would do his work for him for the next 2 weeks. A wet pocket, gentlemen. Perched water. Few buckets and gone by Friday. The clay won't hold under draw. By Christmas she'll be on the Eastern train. He bought his tobacco. He walked out. He left the verdict in the room behind him to do its slow, careful work. The men of the valley nodded thoughtfully. The drillers were experts. The widow was hopeful. The 2 words did not carry the same weight, and every man in that store knew which word the bank lent against and which word it did not. Mrs. Bauer told her husband Hank that night that she had drunk water from the new well herself by the dipper that very afternoon. Hank had looked at her over his coffee cup and said nothing. He owed Crandall $38 from last March's pump work. He liked Sarah well enough, but $38 in Trego County in those years was a sum a man did not cross a driller for. So Hank said nothing. So no one said anything. The neighbors who had been on the verge of riding up to the upland to see the well for themselves found other errands. The 2 men who had been preparing to ask Sarah whether she might walk their land with the notebook quietly put the question aside. Sarah understood by the end of the 2nd week. She had gone to the general store to buy salt and lamp oil. The 3 men at the stove had nodded at her and not spoken. The storekeeper had counted her change without lifting his eyes. She walked back to the wagon and lifted Caleb up to the seat, and she did not speak until they had cleared the edge of town. "Mama," Caleb said, "why are they angry?" "They are not angry, child. They are afraid. Of us, of being wrong. There is a difference." The dip came on the 14th day after striking water. She measured the first hour at sunrise and got 5 gallons, not 8. 5. The bucket came up wet, but the lift was lighter. She measured again at noon and got 5. She measured at sundown and got 6. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open before her, and she read the page about the 5 trunks until the words began to come apart on her in the lamplight. Caleb came down from the loft at midnight and found her with her hands flat on the page and her shoulders shaking once, then again. He took the notebook gently from under her hands. He turned the pages back the way she had taught him. Near the end of the book, on a page she had not read carefully because it was at the very back, he found the passage and he read it aloud, slowly, in the schoolboy voice that was just beginning to deepen. Test the well 3 times in a dry month. Once is luck, twice is hope. 3 times is truth. A perched well dips with a hot day. It does not die on, lest the grove dies. He looked up at the window. The cottonwoods stood black against the moon. The leaves were still moving. The leaves were still silver. Mama, the grove hasn't died. The leaves are still silver. She put her arms around him and held him for a long minute. Then she got up and she lit the second lamp, and she sat down with a fresh sheet of paper and she wrote a brief, polite letter to Mr. Adolphus Thurber, Registrar of Trego County, requesting an inspection of a domestic well for homestead-proof purposes. She would not argue with Crandall. She would not visit the general store. She would simply measure the well at sunrise every day for 30 days and let the figures speak when the registrar came. The contrast was the whole of it, she thought, sealing the letter. The drillers had measured a single dry shaft once with a long iron rod and pronounced a township waterless. She would measure a wet shaft 30 times with a wooden bucket and let the prairie say what it had to say. One reading was a verdict. 30 readings was a truth. She mailed the letter to Mr. Thurber the next morning. She did not pass through Marlin Springs to mail it. She rode 3 miles north to the smaller crossroads at Larch Bend, where the postmaster did not owe Crandall money and did not look at her funny when she handed him the envelope. The postmaster, an old Norwegian named Mr. Olsen who had walked into Trego County the same year as her grandfather had walked the surveys, took the letter with both hands. He looked at the address. For the registrar, yes, sir. He's a careful man. He'll come. I'd be obliged if you'd send it by tomorrow's wagon. It will be on tomorrow's wagon. Mrs. Henley. He did not ask her any other question. He nodded once and put the letter in the slot for the eastbound mail. She rode back with Caleb pressed against her on the wagon seat. Mr. Olsen knew Grandpa, she said as the wagon climbed the last rise toward home. How could he? Your great-grandpa walked these prairies before there were towns. Mr. Olsen was a young man then. They both remember the country before the iron rods came. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Mama, are there many people who remember? Fewer every year, child. That is why the notebook matters. She measured the well at sunrise the next morning. 8 gallons. The dip had broken with the first cool night. She kept a small ledger on the kitchen table, separate from Thomas's old farm ledger. She drew 30 boxes on the page, 7 in a row, and Caleb wrote the gallons per hour in his careful schoolboy hand at the close of each measurement. Day 15, 8 gallons. Day 16, 8. Day 17, 7.5 on a hot day with the wind from the south. Day 18, 8. Day 19, 8. The ledger was less than half a page wide. It was the smallest ledger Sarah had ever kept. It was also, she understood somewhere in the back of her mind during those long, quiet days, the most important thing she would ever sign her name to. By the 20th day, she had stopped going into Marlin Springs entirely. Caleb went on the mule for what they needed. He took the smallest list she had ever written: salt, lamb oil, a spool of thread for the sleeve she had torn on the stone fitting. He came back with news as well as goods. Mr. Crandall is at the store every day, Mama. He says the well will dry by snow. He says it loud. Let him say it. Mr. Olsen at Larch Bend asked me how the well was doing. I told him 8 gallons. He smiled. That's a good man. Child, Mr. Crandall has a partner now. Mr. Baird from Hayes. Sarah looked up from the dough she was kneading. A partner? Mr. Bayard was at the store. He says he will buy our quarter for $32, same as Mr. Crandall offered, only on a deeper rotary rig. He says they'll find the real water. She did not answer for a long time. She turned the dough out onto the board, and she folded it 3 times before she spoke. Did he speak to you, child? He said he was sorry for our trouble. His sorry is a paper sorry. Go put the mule up. Wash before supper. She kneaded the bread harder than she needed to. She thought about Mary Holloway, the widow of Silas Holloway, who had died of pleurisy at McAllister Creek the winter before last. Mary had taken the buyout from the bank for $110 on her quarter that February, and had left for her sister's house in Topeka by March. Sarah had heard, through Mrs. Bauer, that Mary now worked as a seamstress for $2 a week. $2 a week, a quarter section gone. A husband buried in a county Mary would never see again. 3 widows in Trego County had taken buyouts from drillers in the year past. None of the 3 had kept anything. Of the 4 widows that summer, 3 had signed marriage papers inside the 12-month custom to a cowboy, to a German farmer, and to a Methodist preacher whose first wife was barely cold. Sarah was the 4th. She was the only one who had not signed, and the only one who would not sign before her year was out. She had no intention of signing anything except the registrar's inspection certificate. She measured the well at sunrise on day 21. 8 gallons. The letter from Mr. Thurber came back by the next eastbound wagon. He would arrive on the morning of the 31st day. She read the letter twice, and then she folded it small and put it in the inside pocket of her best dress, and she did not show it to Caleb until that evening. He read it carefully. "Mama, Mr. Crandall will come too, won't he?" "Yes, child. I want to be there. You will be there. You have the right to be there. The well is yours as much as it is mine." He nodded once, and he went back to the windlass to draw the evening water. Mr. Adolphus Thurber arrived in a black buggy on the morning of the 31st day. He was 64 years old. He had been registrar of Trego County for 19 years. He wore a black wool suit that was clean for the country he traveled in and steel-rimmed spectacles polished on a cloth he kept in his inside pocket. He carried a brass-fitted measuring rod in a long leather case and a registered logbook with a marbled cover. He stepped down from the buggy and removed his hat at the gate. "Mrs. Henley." "Mr. Thurber, thank you for coming. It is the office, not a favor." "Yes, sir." He did not waste talk. He asked to see the well. She walked him up the rise. Caleb followed behind with a kitchen pendulum clock under both arms. Mr. Thurber's eyebrows lifted very slightly when he saw the cottonwood grove. He stopped at the edge of the green grass and looked up at the silver leaves for a long moment. He said nothing, but Sarah saw him touch the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, the way a careful man tips his hat to a thing he had forgotten was on the prairie. Crandall arrived 10 minutes later on horseback. He came up the rise with his jaw set and his hat brim low. He had brought no notebook. He had brought only his certainty. Mr. Baird from Hayes did not come. Crandall had come alone. "Mr. Thurber, Mr. Crandall, I was told you had been the original driller. You may stand and observe. You will not speak during the measurement." Crandall opened his mouth. He closed it. Mrs. Bauer arrived on foot 2 minutes after that. She had walked up the half-mile from the homestead in her Sunday dress without telling her husband. She stood at the edge of the green and pressed her hands together and did not say a word the whole hour. Mr. Thurber lowered his measuring rod. He measured the diameter of the shaft. He measured the depth from rim to water surface. He recorded both in the marbled logbook. He drew up the bucket on the rope. The bucket Caleb had drawn up 470 times that month, and he timed the recharge of the well by his pocket watch. He measured for 63 minutes. He drew 8 bucketfuls in the first 60. He drew the 9th bucket in the 63rd minute, half full, because he had overdrawn slightly past the minute, and the well had needed 3 minutes to recharge to a full draw. He did not hurry. He did not slow. He kept his pocket watch in his left palm and the rope in his right. When he was done, he sat on a flat stone at the edge of the green, and he wrote in the logbook for what felt to Sarah like a long time. The pen moved across the page in the careful, unbroken script of 19 years of registrar's work. Then he closed the book on his finger, and he stood up, and he read aloud what he had written. 8 gallons drawn within the hour, with consistent recharge throughout. Water clear, no sediment, no taste of clay. Cylinder integrity sound. Sustained yield observed and verified by witness on this day. This is a registered domestic well, suitable for homestead final proof inspection. File number 4112, Trego County. This dry summer. He looked up. "Mrs. Henley, your claim is on track." There was a silence in the cottonwood grove that you could have measured with the same pocket watch. Crandall's mouth opened. A freak-perched aquifer, sir. It won't last winter. Mark me." Mr. Thurber looked at him for a long moment over the rims of his steel spectacles. He did not speak. The silence lasted as long as a man could comfortably hold his breath. Then Caleb stepped forward. He was 10 years old. He was wearing his Sunday clothes, which no longer fit at the wrists. He had washed his face that morning in the kitchen basin without being asked. He looked Crandall in the eye, not angrily, not in triumph, but with the steady gaze of a boy who had been carrying his great-grandfather's notebook in his shirt pocket for 8 weeks and had read it through twice. He spoke one sentence. "My great-grandpa Ezra always said the trees don't lie, sir." The rod just couldn't hear them. Mrs. Bauer pressed a hand to her mouth. Mr. Thurber lifted his pen and wrote one short line in the margin of the logbook. Sarah could not see what he wrote. She found out 2 weeks later that he had written, "Boy Henley, age 10. Words for the record." Crandall stood very still. He removed his hat slowly with both hands. He did not speak. He did not look at Sarah. He did not look at Mr. Thurber. He looked once at the silver leaves of the cottonwoods above the grove, and then he turned and walked his horse down the rise without remounting. By the end of the next month, he had sold his Marlin Springs operation to Mr. Bayard and moved his rig 2 counties west toward the Colorado line. Mrs. Bauer crossed the green grass and put her arms around Sarah without saying anything. The cake she would bring on Saturday was already in her mind. Mr. Thurber closed the logbook and tucked it into his inside coat pocket. He set his hat back on his head. He looked at Caleb for a long, quiet moment before he climbed back into his buggy. "Boy, you did your great-grandfather honor today. Thank you, sir. Mind the well. It is yours now as much as your mother's." "I will, sir." The buggy rolled down the rise. Crandall's horse was already a small shape on the eastern road. The cottonwoods moved their leaves once. 2 summers passed. The Henley homestead changed slowly, the way good things change. The garden tripled. The cattle herd rose from 5 to 10. 2 of the calves were born under the cottonwood grove because Sarah had moved the pen there for the cool shadow on the worst August afternoons. Caleb turned 12. He grew 3 inches in the first of those summers, and he learned to swing a scythe at the end of it. He still carried the small leather notebook in his shirt pocket on long walks, though he rarely opened it anymore. He did not need to. He had read it through twice and committed the cottonwood passage to memory the way other boys memorize psalms. Sarah's quarter section was 4 months from the federal patent. Mr. Thurber's record from the well day stood in the register's logbook in Marlin Springs. 3 other widows in the county had asked her, that second summer, if she would walk their land with her. She had walked all 3. The Coombs family arrived the August of the second summer. Mrs. Hattie Coombs was 28, recently widowed, and traveling west with 2 little girls and a wagon load of furniture she could not afford to ship back to Indiana. She had inherited a quarter section from a brother 3 miles east of the Henley place. The brother had walked into Trego County alone the spring before, filed his claim, lived in a sod dugout for 1 season, and died of brain fever before he saw a second autumn. Crandall's old crew, those of them who had not gone west with him, had drilled a 50-foot test hole on the Coombs claim and pronounced it dry. Hattie had been told by every man who would speak to her in Marlin Springs that the land was worthless. She was preparing to sell it for whatever a passing speculator would pay her and to take the eastbound train back to her sister's house in Indianapolis. Mrs. Bauer brought her to the Henley homestead on a Saturday afternoon. Hattie stepped down from the wagon with 2 little girls behind her, Annie, 8, and Minnie, 6. The little girls had the long-skirted travel dresses of children who have been told to behave. Hattie's eyes were the eyes of a woman who had been looking at one bad door after another for a long month. Sarah brought them lemonade on the porch. "Mrs. Coombs, Mrs. Henley, Lila tells me you had your land called dry. I did. 2 summers passed, and you found water at 12 feet. I did, with my boy on the rope." Hattie set the lemonade glass down. She had not yet drunk from it. "Mrs. Henley, I have been told I'm a fool to believe a thing like that. I was told the same, by the same men often. Will you walk my land with me? I will. She took the leather notebook from the small drawer in the kitchen sideboard where she had kept it for 2 summers. She put it in her own apron pocket. She tied her bonnet. They left the wagon at the Henley gate. They walked the 3 miles to the Coombs claim in the long August afternoon. Caleb walked behind with the 2 little girls. Annie reached up at one point and slipped her hand into Caleb's, and Caleb did not pull his hand away. They found the Coombs cottonwoods on the second pass of the upland. 5 mature trunks, the bark deeply furrowed, the leaves still silver green where the surrounding grass had gone gold. Sarah stopped at the edge of the green, and she opened the notebook to the page with the 5 trunks. She gave the notebook into Hattie's hand. Hattie, count the trunks within the throw of your bonnet. Hattie counted, looking up. Her bonnet brim cast a shadow on the inner ground. 5. Now look at the leaves. Silver. Then the water is closer than the men with their iron rods could ever guess. My grandfather taught me this when I was 9 years old. He learned it from old plains hunters and Cherokee guides who walked this country before there were railroads. The trees know before the well does. Men forget, women remember. Hattie put her hand on the deepest furrowed of the 5 trunks. Her eyes filled. She did not let the tears come down. How long did you dig? 7 days, with my boy on the rope. 12 feet to water. 8 gallons by the hour. Cost me $2 and an old shirt. Annie reached up and touched the bark next to her mother's hand. Minnie hid her face in her mother's skirt. Caleb stood beside Sarah. He did not say anything. He had nothing to add. He had given his great-grandfather's words once, to a man who had needed to hear them, and once was enough. They walked back to the homestead at sundown. That night, by the lamplight at the kitchen table, Sarah copied out the cottonwood passage from the notebook onto a fresh sheet of paper for Hattie to take home. Hattie folded the sheet small and put it inside the locket at her throat. Within 5 years, that passage, copied, recopied, passed in lockets from kitchen to kitchen, would travel through 3 counties of western Kansas, in her town and in her time. Whenever a driller declared a homestead claim dry on the high plains and a widow was offered 20 cents an acre to walk away, somewhere in the next valley a woman would open a folded paper and count cottonwoods. The phrase that traveled with the paper was the one Caleb had spoken at the well day, the one Mr. Thurber had written in the margin of his logbook in his 19th year as registrar. 6 words. They were known among the widows of Trego County and Gove County and Sheridan County for a generation, and a little longer. The trees don't lie. The rod just couldn't hear them. The cottonwoods above the Henley well moved their silver leaves once and were still. Sarah Henley never appeared in any history book. Her name isn't carved on any monument in Trego County. But somewhere tonight, a woman is being told by an expert that she is wrong about her own land, and somewhere else, a woman is opening a small leather book she had almost forgotten her grandfather left her. If her story touched something quiet in you, we'd be grateful for a like and a subscribe to this channel. It helps these stories find the listeners who need them most. And in the comments, tell us whose old wisdom is still listening through you. Thank you for sitting beneath these cottonwoods with us tonight. The silver leaves are still moving because of listeners like you. The end.